Hello everybody, thank you for joining us today. We will just let everybody get online and join us. Hope nobody's having any connection problems today. Looks like it's all working. So it's fantastic of you to join us today. It's my pleasure to be introducing this webinar and talking a little bit about ISSUP as a starter, and then handing over to our speaker, Jeff Lee. So ISSUP is an international membership organisation that is focused on the development, support and representation of a professional workforce within this field, substance use prevention, treatment and recovery support. And by workforce, we really do mean all elements of those who are contributing to this work. We address our mission by sharing the latest evidence-based, ethical, quality information and promoting opportunities for professional development, connection with other professionals, and having that sort of across borders, across fields, nationally and internationally. We are very lucky to work within a network of other workforce development organisations, and we use the expertise of these organisations, ITTC, GCCC, ICUDDR, who are working at different elements within the workforce to really come together and give our ISSUP members access to the full range of opportunities to professionalise. As a global organisation, ISSUP members are separated by distance, so therefore one of our key channels to facilitate that connection and professionalisation is online, and we have a website, newsletter, social media channels, and we're very lucky to use that online platform to be able to deliver our mission. We are able to deliver it locally via our national chapters, who are host organisations around the world, who really are there to connect us within the country to meet the needs of their members there at that local level. And the third way that we deliver our mission are our events like today, and we're delighted that they can happen online and in person, and enabling us to increase our reach, training, knowledge sharing and networking opportunities. So ISSUP is very grateful for the continuing support of INL, the US State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, and we are delighted to have the support of our members, our partner organisations and the experts in the field that really enrich the content that we can provide to our ISSUP members, such as today. So we have a focus of today's webinar on prevention. There is interpretation happening in Spanish, Russian and Urdu, and the instructions for that are in the chat. So please have a look and connect with that interpretation. We're going to have our presentation from Jeff and then questions at the end. So please put those in the questions chat box. If we don't get to your questions in this session, we will build longer into the next part, because this is a two-part webinar, to make sure that we cover those, or that they're covered within the content of the actual presentation. So please send all your questions to us and we'll see how we can cover those. Or the presentation that Jeff's going to do today and a recording of this whole webinar will be available on the ISSUP website, so you'll be able to watch again or pass it on to those in your network, and a certificate will be sent to you after the event. So it's time to introduce our speaker today, and it's our privilege to be hearing from Jeff Lee, who's the previous Executive Director of ISSUP and an experienced expert voice in the field of prevention. Prior to ISSUP, Jeff worked as Executive Director of Mentor International, which is a substance abuse prevention charity, with the primary aim to identify, support and disseminate best practice. So he's continuing along that theme. Jeff has a commitment to communicating the findings from science and research as relevant and accessible to the practitioner and policymaker. And in that capacity, we are delighted that he will be taking us through an introduction to prevention through another of his passions, football, today. So I'll hand over to you, Jeff. Thank you very much for doing this today, and enjoy this, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much, Joanna. Spot on in terms of what I'm hoping to do and have always been trying to do, is to make that transfer from research and what we can learn from theory and put it into active practice, but more of that later on can I thank everyone for giving their time to join us today, to join this match. I thought I was wanting to have some music, you know, and be Gary Lineker and open the programme, match of the day style, for those of you who are in UK or know what happens on a UK football scene. But I realise we've got an international audience here, so I hope to keep it something that is relevant to you all. Just two apologies on my health front. One, I had some treatment on my eyes last week, which means I have to wear sunglasses for a while to keep the bright light out, and that's only just happened recently because it's been raining all morning and now the sun's come out. And secondly, I've managed to contract a cold off my granddaughter, which means I'm struggling a little bit in terms of my voice, and so bear with me on that, and apologies, but thank you for being here. So yes, so what are we about? I just want to spend this first half of our two halves of the match to have a review of what it means and requires in terms of substance use and the issue of prevention. And it's not rocket science. I'm not saying anything that's particularly new, but I'm trying to communicate it through a different medium. And as Joanna says, through my second passion of that of football, and see if we can make something that is going to be relevant to people through a different communication method. Just to say at the outset, these are my thoughts and my ideas, my reflections after spending probably too many years now in the field, since working in the 70s, all that time ago. And believe you me, some of the things have changed, but others haven't changed that much. So it's my views. They're not necessarily those of ISSUP. And I do declare there's no vested interest in the provision of this input. So it was interesting that when I always wanted to, and have been trying to put together this concept of substance use prevention and the issue of substance use in a different medium of football, the analogy of football. And I have to admit, it's not always very strong. There's a lot of weaknesses in the analogy, and I'm sure you could find there are cracks in it, but bear with me if you would. I saw this advert some years ago now. I think I was working in the Middle East when, if you remember, the Orange Communication Company, and this was their advert to try and get people to join their company. I'm 1 billion people and one common language, football. Well, I gather today we are now 8 billion people in the world. So I'm not sure where the 1 billion people are, but I think those are the ones that must have joined Orange. And I just think it was very useful. I know I spent a lot of time talking to people and always feeling apologetic that people have had to speak in English to communicate. And often we've not had a common language, and yet football may be one way now that breaks gender barriers even now, and other issues of language and culture, and something as the World Cup approaches, in spite of all its concerns and questions, and in terms of where it's taking place, it is something where millions of people will be turning to their TVs and talking and communicating about this strange game that people like me follow and support and spend money on and don't really know why. So through football. So what are the objectives of this match? What I'd like to consider, hope we can achieve, is this, through this attempt of the analogy, I'd like to address a range of things. One is, what is the role of prevention and the substance use issue within drug demand reduction? We talk about drug demand reduction, and where is prevention within that drug demand reduction FC? I'd like to then consider the opposition that our team faces, because there is a lot of opposition and a lot of challenges for what we do in this field. And then to consider some of the basic issues I think need to be addressed in how we go about our substance use prevention, and how can we move towards an effective and achieving team that can get into the Premier League and stay there. And then to look at some of the questionable approaches that may, if we take them on, mean that we end up being relegated. And then some of the challenges for our approach to evidence-based prevention and how that can inform our planning for the season ahead, and the principles on which that work should be based. Have we got our tactics in place? Do we know what we're doing and why we're doing it? And finally, to look at the next steps. How can we move forward in building the road to promotion and to life in the Premier League? So that's what I hope we can look at in the whole match. In terms of our first half today, I'd like to look at, as I say, drug demand reduction FC and position of prevention within drug demand reduction, looking at the opposition, who we're playing against, because I think we can learn from the opposition, and how we go about avoiding relegation, what approaches and tactics ought we need consider to use, and what ought to consider not using. So on we go. Drug demand reduction FC. I think many of you will, some of you may have seen this before, but many of you will know that our efforts in drug demand reduction have often been focused on supply control. How can we stop drugs getting into countries, getting into the hands of people who can then trade it, and ultimately to people that then use those substances that can cause harm. And supply control has been led by the attack. It's our forward line, where we see the customs service, laws and law and order, and the police being very active in trying to do something about stopping the supply of substances getting through to the potential users. And a lot of money has been spent on this. They're our goal scorers. There's, like most forward lines, they cost a lot of money. There's a lot of money put into the forward line, but we do have to ask how many goals have they scored and how many goals have they missed. Are they effective in terms of being the best strike force? Some would argue that for every goal they score, they miss 99. So are they really effective and cost effective in putting all our energy into that area of our team? The next effort that we did was to move, say, well, if we can they get through the forward line, we need to look at the defense. We need to look at how we can help people who then become the victims of substance use and have the harms that drugs can cause. And we put our efforts into treatment and to recovery support. We put into looking at how we can provide treatment services and recovery support services and inputs, looking at alternatives to substance use and how we can help people on that, and how we can build self-help groups, the different ways in which we can address the problem of substance use in order to avoid the people becoming victims and getting through and goals being scored. And again, very important in our team to have that and to have the work and effort. Probably gets less money and resources than the forward line, but important. And increasingly people accept that we've got to look at this area as a public health issue, and we need to look at how we can help support those who have a substance use problem. From my perspective, I think where we've missed out is the role of the midfield, because this area of demand reduction as opposed to supply control does have a midfield, and that for me is where prevention and education plays its role. That's where we need to put the role of education of, yes, we do need information and awareness raising, and we do need a focus on prevention, because it's the midfield. It often doesn't get the limelight, it doesn't get the goal scored or the on-the-line saves, but is the one that actually works both to help the attack and to help the defence, and is the engine room that often is the key to a successful team. And again, within the team, it is a team. It's often been that midfield that haven't got the resources and attention that perhaps they deserve and require. But it is a team, and that's the drug demand reduction team that goes into work. So what about the opposition that team faces? And what are the questions that our team poses? Well, there is opposition. There are a large number of teams who are in our league alongside our Demand Reduction FC, and so there are lots of their players within their teams that we need to tackle. Get that tackle? It's a football tackle. Yeah, I hope so. And each one is a team on its own within the league, and many of them are extremely well financed, well resourced, well supported teams. And perhaps we have to begin to consider if there's any value in looking at how we present our team. Do we come in as Drug Demand Reduction FC? We have an issue when we look at the whole terminology we use about drugs as to whether we're talking about legal or illegal substances or medication. Do we break up our team into different substances, for example? Or do we, as we will find, there are lots of other teams working in the prevention field, think about how we might amalgamate or separate, as well as separate our efforts is a way of joining with others. And I think the challenge, whatever we do in terms of prevention, and certainly prevention and substance use, is that every game we play is a hard one, and winning the league is going to be quite a challenge. So perhaps we have to address our objectives. Where do we aspire to end up in our league? Can we really expect to be the top of the league, given all that we're battling against and the opposition we face? Is it about management? Is it about tackling the harm that drugs can cause? Or what is our objective and what are our aspirations as a team, and how we focus on that team? And whatever we do, we're going to have to compete, because there's lots of other players there, lots of other teams there, and if we're going to have an impact, we've got to be prepared to compete. So this is the opposition I think we face, and I can't offer you the final league table, but I'd be challenging you to say, how would you think it would finish if we had all these teams playing, as we do have these teams playing. So for example, we have Industry United, and they're a very strong team, well resourced, well financed, well backed, all the marketing, communications, PR, quite a team to tackle when we're addressing issues of substance use, particularly illegal substances. We've got the team that says, well, it's not my problem. Why should we bother about this issue? So there's a loud voice that says it's not an issue. We've got a lot of ignorance in terms of when we come to play our games and promote prevention. So how do we educate and try and address that? We've got the team that's more about vested interest that we need to challenge, because their vested interest is not to focus on prevention, but to look at their own needs and desires. And then we got the friendly teams, the health promotion park rangers. So they're in a similar league, a similar area of work, but at the same time, they are separate and taking a slice of the cake in terms of the resources that we put into our prevention efforts. And we've obviously got the can't afford it. Perhaps it's a good idea, but we can't afford to do anything team to tackle. We've got another friendly team, road safety, is a prevention area. We've got the political lobby, which is often stronger, a very strong voice in getting certain things through that might not be so supportive of the work we want to do in prevention. And that, for example, is the Brewers as a team of its own, where the whole industry, the alcohol industry, has got a very strong team out there that will often say it wants to work with prevention, but if we really ask what their ultimate objective is, I think it's to sell more alcohol, isn't it? We've got the Freedom to Choose team. Why are we making such a nanny state issue of people's choice. It's up to them. We've got our team, which at the moment exists as substance use prevention. And as I say, one of the challenges is to ask, is that the right name of our team? Should we rephrase how we call ourselves and present ourselves? We've got the Political Will Wednesday team. Sheffield Wednesday, Political Will Wednesday, rest of the week. Trying to be humorous, but failing again. So it's about political will. That's necessary, and that's an opposition to get on side. We've got the substance use treatment team, in a sense, part of the drug demand reduction team, but in themselves, they're in opposition because they need the resources in the same way we do. We've got the same with supply control, which is part of our team, but also a separate team that needs resourcing and supporting. And increasingly now we've got a lot of emphasis on mental health awareness as an issue about health and, again, prevention. And a relatively new area, and particularly in football, when you think of advertising, you've got the gambling concern FC, which is getting a lot of money, but also a lot of problems in terms of how do we prevent the issue of gambling getting bigger than it is. So a lot of players, a lot of people competing together against each other, fighting for resources, recognition, and for their own objectives. Just a word about the friendly opposition. We can list all those that are concerned with specific issues of prevention, suicide, road safety, cancer, gambling. And we think of those that are not just concerned with preventing things, they put their focus on promotion and promoting positives, health promotion, mental health promotion, healthy eating. And it'd be interesting to look at their league table position. Do you think they'd end up above us, substance use prevention, or below us? And why? What can we learn from the answer to that? If they're above us in the table, what is it because of their issue? Is it because of the way they present their issue? And what is the learning for us from that? And I think it does pose this question of what do we call the substance use prevention team? Because again, there are always two sides to prevention. Prevention is about don't do something, stopping people doing things. But the other side of the prevention coin is how can we promote and encourage positives in how people are able to live and behave in terms of not getting involved with the harm that drugs can cause. And therefore, do we look at it from a different substance perspective, or do we build it on a healthy perspective and make it a broader issue? And I think that's quite a challenge, because even the term substance use prevention, are we preventing substance use? Well, it depends, I suppose, what substances we're talking about, or what group we're talking about, or what setting we're talking about. And that in itself is an issue and debate that we need to have. And just to say, I mentioned COVID here, just to say what can be achieved if there's political will and resources when one has to address what was an international issue that needed to be prevented and treated, and look what could be achieved when there is that sort of input. So how do we go about building a more competitive substance use prevention team? And again, I'll leave the terminology for as a question, and there are more questions and answers in what I'm saying here anyway, but I think it is a challenge in how we present ourselves and whether substance use prevention is the appropriate terminology in what our objectives are. But at the same time, we are focused on substance use, and to ignore that would mean it often gets swallowed up and not taken on board. So that's quite a challenge. If we're going to build a competitive team, I think we've got to look back and learn from the past what we've done, and whether that was appropriate, and how do we learn as to whether we should continue or change in what we do and the tactics we use and the approach we have in forming our team. So we need to look at the approaches and the tactics and both from the past and what that means for what we do now and what we do in the future. What are the questions to be addressed from those approaches, from those tactics, and what have we learned therefore in developing principles of that are fundamental to how we go about our prevention in the future. So I've just put together some of the things that have, I think, been quite common, and again, nothing new, that we've come across in the tactics that have been used in the teams we've put out in the past. And we need to say, are those tactics appropriate and relevant to how we play the game in the 2020s? So tactics that go back to the 70s and 80s, when I think that's when the whole substance drug use issue became on the agenda in terms of what we should be doing about it. And certainly that's when I started to get involved. So I say, perhaps I'm too old to give this, but anyway, here we are. I can remember when health education first started, and it started particularly to say what should we do in our schools, and it was started with the concept that we should provide young people with information, and that information should be about teeth, nits and naughty bits. In other words, we should teach people how to clean their teeth. We should make sure they check their hair for nits, and we should begin to think about what do we say about sex education and where does that fit as people grow up and we're concerned about what happens. So we started giving information and started saying health education is important, and that was quite a step on one level. One way we then addressed it was through media campaigns, particularly when it came to the issue of drugs. There were a lot of media campaigns. Most of them were focused on trying to scare people, giving some very horrifying images of what will happen if you take drugs. And this was felt to be a way of putting people off. Did it put people off? I think the question, the marks very much is there. So some would argue, and the research might tell us that actually it turned some people on. And for others, it had no impact at all. And for others, it was so different to their own experience and understanding and knowledge that they ignored it. So is scaring people and just the use of media campaigns on their own going to be effective without looking a little bit deeper into those issues and those approaches? So we very much were focused on tell them the dangers, tell them the harm. Often we need to remember that young people, where the focus was in this work, already knew those dangers and harms themselves and weren't going to be put off when we came with our scare stories. In terms of how we addressed it and tackled it, it was said, well, this is the job of the school in particular. Their responsibility to educate our young people about drugs and the dangers of drugs. But at that time, whilst it was a sensible suggestion, very little went into how we then helped those who were providing that education in schools and training them, or what they should use in their schools and where it should go in the curriculum, at what age and at what message. And thankfully, it did develop over the years, where we started to say that this was an area that should happen from very early through the whole school process and then afterwards. And the focus might be more on teaching young people respect for themselves and their bodies and other people. Initially, it was very much left to people to do tell them the information piece with that little backing. So lived experience, often used then to get people in who've been through a drug problem themselves, and then giving their experience of how they had gone through this terrible experience but have come through at the other end. as achieving the platform to tell people not to take drugs. And that sort of mixed message had a lot of concern about, is this an effective way, and what was really the message that it gave young people when people were then able to talk about their problems, but show that it actually could come through it and get a profile. And again, so no issue about context for that approach. Just say no obviously became the famous saying of how we should tell people just say no. That was the campaign slogan. My understanding of just say no was designed for a small particular group, to reinforce the fact that they were never likely to use drugs in the first place. And a just say no message then was a reinforcer. It then was taken on as a way to approach drug prevention generally. And again, drugs, what do we mean? Are we talking about all drugs? Are we talking about medication or prescribed over-the-counter drugs? Are we talking about illegal drugs? Are we talking about the legal, socially acceptable and available drug substances? And that's often a debate because a lot of the money and approaches were focused on illegal substances, when we knew that the major problem, and the one that still remains is the major problem, was that of young people and their use of legal substances, and particularly looking at alcohol and tobacco were certainly the substance of concern in 70s and 80s. Drug-free, promoting a drug-free society. Possible, desirable? Do we think of the substances or the drugs that have actually been very positive, the medication that actually are drugs, but they actually give a lot of help and support? And can we really achieve a drug-free society, or is it about managing and protecting young people, or educating about avoiding the harm that substances can cause? So I think a debate still to be had about whether a drug-free message is appropriate. We often resorted to testing, but the question there is, so what? We test somebody, we find they've used, what happens next? And there wasn't the backups or the thinking through about how that could be used. Perhaps that person got help and support, but what it did in terms of the overall issue of prevention, not too sure. And then, of course, there's this whole issue of, we started looking at drugs from the perspective of, this is a problem. We have a drug problem. And this meant that our mindset from the outset was about dealing with problems rather than how do we help people, and what is the issue about drugs, or is it about the people that use them and why they use them, and how can we prevent them from coming to harm from any use that they got involved with. It then did start to focus on building skills and looking at protective factors and risk factors, and trying to equip the individual to cope with the drug offer, because often we realize that people don't make a choice out of the information they have, but because of their ability to deal with the situation they face. Law and punishment remained an issue of where we ought to still have a profile. If people use drugs, it still at that stage was law and punishment were the needs, and we started to still put our focus on supply issues, and if not, we often resorted to punishment, and possibly we ended up in treatment, and happily we have seen, let's say, the health message coming through. So quickly, as a review, these tactics. So information, yes, but not enough on its own. Media campaigns, the same, sufficient on their own, and what is their nature, what is their setting, what is their target group, how do they link with other things that we should be doing if we're providing a media campaign. Just to do a scare them tactic is not going to be effective. I think we've learnt that. Tell them the dangers, well, often they knew already, and does that have the impact? Is it the job of the school on its own, or are there other stakeholders? Perhaps the issue of drug prevention or substance use prevention is because it is so broad. We've got so many stakeholders that need to be involved and that have a role to play, be it family, be it in the workplace, be it in the community, be it through the use of media. There's a range of stakeholders that have a role to play in the prevention issue. Lived experience, well, maybe, but who and what training and how do they do it and when do they do it and with what context and linked to what? Perhaps we need to consider that if it's going to have a role to play. Just say no. We know it's not that easy. I was taught that if you went to a state school, it was just say no. If you went to a private school, it was just say no, thank you. Drugs, what do we mean by drugs? Drug-free, possible, desirable. Testing, what does it achieve? And a problem, is that the best focus? And even though we do concentrate on the needs of the individual and how we can equip the individual to function in a world where substance use is there, it often is not about the choices the individual has. It's about opportunity. It's about the context of where they live. It's about poverty. It's about income. It's about their place and feeling of dignity and opportunity. And so the individual may be a need, but we also look at the context in which that individual functions if we're going to actually address the reasons why people end up using substances that can cause them harm. And to say the need to look at not only supply, but we need to look at demand issues, and we need to look at preventing, not just treating. So, reflections. Lots of questions there about the tactics that we should use and the approaches we should take, and how that reflects on the team that we need to start thinking we build for the future, both in terms of its name, in terms of the approaches it should use, the target groups that it has. Perhaps what does come through is that we need to think about how football itself has developed in terms of how we go about coaching and professionalizing how we play football, in the same way as we need to think about how we need to professionalize how we go about our work in prevention. A focus on the team approach. It isn't just one group. We've got a multidisciplinary effort, even within prevention, where we need to focus on how do we work together as a team in equipping people to take on their role in prevention. And that means looking at how we can look at what we provide for everybody, but also look at what we can provide not only in that universal setting, but both in the selected and the indicated level, where we have people who may be on the verge and vulnerable, or maybe already engaged in substance use. So the settings, the workforce, and our objectives we've got to look at the team approach. What about the training of the players? Are we really equipping those who we see as having a role in prevention? Have we put the energy into that? I always remember that Giovanna Campello, who may be listening, and always we use the term we need to build the preventionists. Perhaps it is the preventionists FC that we ought to be talking about. And how can we have a specialist workforce? Because prevention, until recently, has not been seen as a science and a specialism on its own that has the need to equip people as to how they go about taking prevention, and that there are specific needs and issues and specialisms for the settings and people and type of work that they undertake. So training the players is very important. What about the ethics involved? Have we really taken on board our ethics and how we go about our work? If we're about preserving human rights and human dignity, what is it we can and should do and what is it that we ought to really avoid. The means and the ends need to be considered. Effectiveness, increasingly now we're looking at the 3 E's of effectiveness: evidence base and evaluation. And I think we have only recently decided that we need to put more energy into looking at what is the evidence base of what we do, and rightly so, that we need to have a understanding of whether what we do has an impact, has an effect, is efficacious and does work. And we need therefore to put the energy into evaluation and into research, and make sure that what we do certainly doesn't cause more harm to people, and try to find out if it can actually do some positive good. So the renewed focus on those areas is, I think, something that we're only now beginning to realize with the work of UNODC and the international standards, with the European Drug Quality Standards, prevention standards. We've begun to realize that we need to base our work on what we feel are the standards that need to be put in place before we undertake and as we undertake our work in prevention. So very important areas that begin to make us realize prevention is a science and deserves a specialist workforce that is trained. But our team needs to be managed, and perhaps this is the challenge. I think, who's managing our efforts in drug prevention? Do we leave that to government, or is it local government, or is it the non-government sector? We know if we haven't got a good manager, that we're in football, they get the sack pretty quick. And who is our manager in terms of the work? Is it UNODC? Is it Colombo Plan? Is it? I think this is a real concern, that who is managing our work and who is coordinating it, and are we doing it in a way that shares and understands and collaborates and cooperates? We often use those words, but does it really happen? Are we collaborating, cooperating and managing what we do? And of course, finance and commitment at the end of the day. If we're going to have a team that is going to be effective, that's going to be work and do well, we have to put money into it, and we have to have a commitment towards it. So perhaps that's in the football terms, that's the ownership. Who's going to own the club and put money into it to help make it work and be effective? And these, I think, are the challenges that we need to consider. Players' competence, I think that's linked with a whole issue of how do we build the right team, the right players, and give them the training and capacity and ability to make a contribution in their different positions. And there are different positions within the team. A good striker isn't necessarily a good defender. A good midfield player isn't necessarily a good striker. They need the players who've got competence for the different roles that they play within the team. And what is that structure of the team? How are we going to organize ourselves? Who's going to play where? And how do we make sure we've got a plan in how we go about our game? So I hope that's raised questions that are worth raising and help to make you think about how we move forward. In reviewing this first half, I tried to look at what were the key considerations and learning for me when I look back on what we've done and how we've done it, and why our team has only just been promoted to the Premier League and is now third from the bottom. I'm thinking of my own team, Nottingham Forest. You see, they're there, but how are they going to progress? How are they going to challenge? And in our own substance use team, however we create it, I think in making our efforts, we need to remember certain things. One is the team game, and how do we build that team, and how to equip that team? How do we identify the team and give it the specialisms that go beyond the natural talent, the interest they have? How can we build their capacity and ability? So it's a team effort. We have to remember and bear in mind the opposition is strong. and look at how the opposition play their game, and how do we learn from that, and do we work with them? And many would say we shouldn't. Many should say, well, we have to partner and work together. Whatever it is we decide, we have to remember that we can learn from what they do, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to be part of their team. But the opposition is strong. We need to review our approaches. We need to look at how we play the game, our tactics that we use, and what we can have learned from what we've done in the past, and build now on the fact that we are starting to build the evidence base. We are doing the research to find out what works and what's effective. I'm always concerned when we say we should only do things that we've shown to be effective. How do we then develop new ideas and new things? I think we do have to build new things, but we do have to test them and try them to find out if they work. And not only if they work in the research setting, which I remember in my past talking to a very well-known researcher who showed some extremely good results in terms of his program, in terms of delaying onset of substance use. But when he also said, if I remember when we did this as a research project, we had all the money, we had greenhouse conditions, we could get people involved to do it as we intended it to be done. But when I put it into the reality of anybody using it and making it available, it won't achieve the same, because we can't do things in greenhouse conditions. And I think the other thing we need to talk about is whether what works in one setting will work in another, and that particularly in terms of culture, and what is relevant and works in one culture does not necessarily mean that it will work in another culture and setting without proper adaptation issues and the research and evaluation about that aspect as well. So an approaches review, and then we need to select carefully based on the evidence in terms of how we go about our team selection and how we approach the game. And we need to update our tactics in terms of how we play the game and the approaches that we use in the future. If we don't, I think we end up as toast. So they're the 5 areas. What I want to do in the second half is to look at what stays and what goes in the way we go about our work, what we've learned and what we now need to take on board. I'd like to look at what's missing and where are we needing some new players if we're going to be effective. And I'd like to look at what our long-term strategy and principles might be for achieving in the Premier League. So I hope you'll join me for the second half, where the focus will be on challenges for evidence-based prevention and planning for the season ahead. What are the principles and the tactics that are required on which we should formulate the way we go about our play in the season ahead for prevention, and what are the next steps in the road to promotion and the Premier League? Well, even if we've just achieved it, we may go down and need to look at how we get back up there. What is the road to promotion in the Premier League? I think we've played 45 minutes. It may be a little short. Sorry if that's true, the referee. I just want to thank you for your patience and your time in listening and giving your time to this. If you've got questions, I'm sure you've asked them during this session, but can hand back to Joanna. And as I say, thank you very much for your time. I hope to see you in the second half.
Thank you, Jeff. That was excellent, walking us through the sort of prevention up to now, and with a really, interesting and different angle of football that has been amusing everyone, as we've seen on the chat. So thank you for that. We have had a few questions, so I'll start off with one. They said, in the midfield where the schools are currently, what are the main challenges that have been detected and what sort of strategies have worked well?
Okay, Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is with all our approaches to schools and the role of schools, and they can play make a major contribution, but we also know that the major challenges that schools face to do everything for everybody, and where does substance use prevention fit into a very crowded curriculum, where we still have not got the trained teachers, where we still got the challenges of whether we should be focusing on drug use or whether we should be focusing on other areas of prevention, or a broader issue of health and personal social development, personal and social education. So I think there is that real question mark as to what is going to be realistic in terms of what we can ask schools to do. What is the training required? How should we place our substance use prevention alongside the whole other range of health and health behavior issues? And for me, of course, I think it should be central. What we want young people to come through education with, I'd like them to come through. Priority for me is that they are healthy people and know how to undertake a healthy and well, socially acceptable life and find opportunities to make the best of themselves. Schools have also other challenges on them. So I think it's about giving schools the resources, the training, and giving them some guidance on time they can give to this broad area of health promotion and health behavior. Unrealistic, perhaps, to think they can always take different issues. The principles of healthy behavior and prevention are the same for a whole range of content topics. So let's find those principles and then build our content on top of that. Sorry if that's a bit loose and broad, but there's so many challenges and questions for schools if they're going to be effective.
That's helpful, thank you. Another question came in that asked about, in England or the other areas that you've worked in prevention, is there evidence to support the effectiveness of drug prevention? How do we sort of use that as that advocacy tool?
Well, I think there is increasingly, and I think the evidence base is shown by the work, let's say, of UNODC, which I mentioned, has begun to say that there are ways and approaches that we've used in schools and for other groups and settings that are necessary and can be effective. So it's about looking at what we've learned about where we should focus those efforts in looking at the whole areas of programs that we can provide in schools. We can think of examples of strengthening families. We can think of unplugged. We can think of programs that people have used, that people have shown to be effective and that people are now using in schools. But I do think there is a need to build that evidence base, to provide the training and to provide the practical tools that teachers can use, because we are beginning to realize that there are those programs, and with the right training and with the right ethos and support and resources in the school, they can make an impact.
And very much related to that, we've had a few questions in about how people that are on the ground in the field doing the practice can do that research, that evaluation. You know, what should they be measuring? Just some sort of guidance, or where should they go for help on, you know, in that step?
Yeah, I think that's a real important and valid question, because I think so many people are working on the ground either can't or don't access the information that's available to them or should be available to them, and don't know where to go. And then for help and support and advice and training, I hope that's one role ISSUP's trying to play, is to give them access and information to the research, to what's available and how they can access training. I think that's where the national chapters in those countries where we have them, I hope, can give that help and support and advice. But I do think that is a challenge. It's who can I go to for help? Who can I go to get training? Where are the resources? So we often have to go to the UNODC website or the EMCDDA website and to find out what they've got available. and I think it's a job of ISSUP and other similar organisations is to share that information so that people can find out where to go and where to get help and advice. But it's a big challenge.
Okay, thank you. And I think we've got time for one last question. Why is it not recommended to use fear-based messages for drug use prevention?
I suppose the easy answer to that is because it doesn't work. But I think it's a matter of, again, looking at the ethics of whether that is an appropriate tactic, whether it's true, whether it's honest in terms of the images and the message that the scare tactics give. Is it appropriate? It's not to say that obviously we can use different tactics in how we use media, but it needs to be within a much broader framework of are we clear about our objectives? Are we clear about our target group? Are we clear about whether that message will actually be effective and that it won't cause harm? Because some of the messages that have used scare tactics, I think of the heroin campaign in the 80s in the UK, that actually was shown that had the opposite effect to scaring people from using drugs, and actually meant that some young people who were perhaps vulnerable in the first place felt this was an encouragement, and they actually related to some of the messages and images that were used in that campaign. So if I do things because I'm scared of them, and or I can see a scary message, either I ignore it, I write it off, I question its validity, and unless somebody can prove to me that it works, I'm unlikely to say that it's something we should go with.
Okay, thank you. That brings us exactly to the end of our hour. We have had a flood of questions. So as I said at the beginning, we will look at those. You can carry on putting anything that you want to cover in the next session in the next 2 minutes before we close the webinar, and you can always get in touch with ISSUP if there's anything else that you would like to cover, and we'll have a slightly longer Q&A session in the next part. I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us. Thanks ever so much to Jeff for an excellent presentation that was really very engaging. And thank you to all of the ISSUP staff who've been working behind the scenes to bring this webinar to you today. A little reminder, the slides and the recording of the session will be on the ISSUP website. We will be sending you a certificate of participation. And thanks again for all of your questions and comments and engagement with us. The part 2 that Jeff talked about is happening on the 29th of November. If you want to see more information on that or any of the upcoming online events that ISSUP's running, and there's lots over the next few weeks, please go to the ISSUP website and have a look. And if you're not already an ISSUP member, please do join. It's free, and we'd love to welcome you as part of our community. Any last words, Jeff?
No, just to say thank you very much. Yes, obviously colleagues for all their help and support, and for just people giving their time and thought to these issues. I haven't got all the answers. I've got a lot of questions, but together I think what we can do is build a more effective prevention in the future. I hope you'll join us for the second half and that we can win the match.
Excellent. Thank you. See you all soon.
Thank you.